Page 84. Within the overall wave of those from formerly occupied areas, there followed, one after another, the quick and compact waves of the nationalities which had transgressed. In 1943, the Kalmyks, Chechens, English, and Balkars. In 1944, the Crimean Tatars. They would not have been pushed out into eternal exile so energetically and swiftly had it not been that regular army units and military trucks were assigned to help the organs. The military units gallantly surrounded the olds or settlements, and within 24 hours, with the speed of a parachute attack, those who had nested there for centuries had found themselves removed to railroad stations, loaded by trainload, and rushed off to Siberia, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and the Russian North. Within one day, their land and their property had been turned over to their heirs. What had happened to the Germans at the beginning of the war now happened to these nationalities. They were exiled solely on the basis of blood. There was no filling out questionnaires. Party members, heroes of labor, and heroes of the still unfinished war were all sent along with the rest. During the last years of the war, of course, there was a wave of German war criminals who were selected from the POW camps and transferred by court verdict to the jurisdiction of Gulag. In 1945, even though the war with Japan didn't last 3 weeks, great numbers of Japanese war prisoners were raked in for urgent construction projects in Siberia and Central Asia. And the same process of selecting war criminals for Gulag was carried out among them. At the end of 1944, when our army entered the Balkans, and especially in 1945, when it reached into Central Europe, a wave of Russian emigres flowed through the channels of Gulag. Most were old men who had left at the time of the revolution, but there were also young people who had grown up outside Russia. They usually dragged off the menfolk and left the women and children where they were. It is true that they did not take everyone, but they took all those who, in the course of 25 years, had expressed even the mildest political views, who had expressed them earlier during the revolution. They did not touch those who had lived on a purely vegetable existence. The main waves came from Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. There were fewer from Austria and Germany, and in other countries of Eastern Europe, there were hardly any Russians. As if in response to 1945, a wave of emigres poured from Manchuria too. Some of them were not arrested immediately. Entire families were encouraged to return to the homeland as freed persons, but once back in Russia, they were separated and sent into exile or taken to prison. All during 1945 and 1946, a big wave of genuine, at long last, enemies of the Soviet government flowed into the archipelago. These were the Vlasov men, the Krasnov Cossacks, the Muslims from the national units created under Hitler. Some of them had acted out of conviction. Others had been involuntary participants. Along with them were seized not less than 1 million fugitives from the Soviet government, civilians of all ages and of both sexes who had been fortunate enough to find shelter on Allied territory, but who in 1946-47 were perfidiously returned by Allied authorities into Soviet hands. A certain number of Poles, members of the Home Army, followers of Mikhailovchik, arrived in Gulag in 1945 via our prisons. Excuse me 1 second. There were a certain number of Romanians and Hungarians. At war's end and for many years after, there flowed uninterruptedly an abundant wave of Ukrainian nationalists, the Banderovsky. Again, the background of this enormous post-war displacement of millions, few paid against the background. Few paid much attention to such small waves as foreigners' girlfriends in 1946-47. In other words, Soviet girls who went out with foreigners. They sentenced these girls under Article 735, socially dangerous elements. Spanish children, the same children who had been taken from their homeland during the Spanish Civil War, but who were adults by the end of World War II. Raised in our boarding schools, they nonetheless fitted very poorly into our life. Many longed to go home. They too were given 735, socially dangerous element. And those who were particularly stubborn got 58-6, espionage on behalf of America. In fairness, we must not forget the brief reverse wave of priests in 1947. Yes, a miracle. For the first time in 30 years, they freed priests. They didn't actually go about seeking them out in camps, but whenever a priest was known to people in freedom, and whenever a name and exact location could be provided, the individual priests in question were sent out to freedom in order to strengthen the church, which was, at that time, was being revived. We have to remind our readers once again that this chapter does not attempt by any means to list all the ways which fertilized Gulag, but only those which had a political coloration. And just as, of course, in physiology, after a detailed description of the circulation of the blood, one can begin over again and describe in detail the lymphatic system. One could begin again and describe the waves of known political offenders and habitual criminals from 1918 to 1953. And this description too would run long. It would bring to light many famous decrees, now in part forgotten, even though they have never been repealed, which supplied abundant human material for the insatiable archipelago. One was the decree on absenteeism. One was the decree on production of bad quality goods. Another was on smoke and moonshine distilling. Its peak period was 1922, but arrests for this were constant throughout the 20s. And the decree on the punishment of collective farmers for failure to fulfill the obligatory norm of labor days, and the decree on the introduction of military discipline on railroads, issued in April 1943, not at the beginning of the war, but when it had already taken a turn for the better. In accordance with the ancient patroon tradition, these decrees always put in an appearance as the most important element in all our legislation, but without any comprehension of or reference to the whole of our previous legislation. Learned jurists were supposed to coordinate the branches of law, but they were not particularly energetic at it, nor particularly successful either. The steady pulse of decrees led to a current national pattern of violations and crimes. One could easily recognize in neither burglary, nor murder, nor semagun distilling, nor rape ever seemed to occur at random intervals or in random places throughout the country as a result of human weakness, lust, or failure to control one's passions. By no means. One detected, instead, a surprising unanimity and monotony in crimes committed. The entire Soviet Union would be in a turmoil of rape alone, or murder alone, or semagun distilling alone. Each in its turn, in sensitive reaction to the latest government decree, each particular crime or violation seemed to somehow be playing into the hands of the latest decree, so that it would disappear from the scene that much faster. And that precise moment, a particular crime which had just been foreseen, or for which the wise new legislation had just provided stricter punishment, would explode simultaneously everywhere. The decree on the militarization of railroads crowded military tribunals with the women and adolescents who did most of the work on the railroads during the war years, and who, having received no barracks training beforehand, were those mostly involved in delays and violations. The decree on failure to fulfill the obligatory norm on labor dates was greatly simplified. The procedure for removing from the scene those collective farmers who were dissatisfied with receiving their labor for their labor mere Labor Day points in farm account books and wanted produce instead, whereas previously their cases had required trial based on the article of the code relating to economic counter-revolution. Now it was enough to provide a collective farm decree confirmed by the district executive committee, and even then these collective farmers, although they were sent into exile, must have been relieved to know that they were not listed as enemies of the people. The obligatory norm of labor days was different in different areas, the easiest of all being the peoples of the Caucasus, 75 labor days a year. But despite that, many of them were also sent off to Krasnoyarsk province for 8 years. As we have said, we are not going to go into a lengthy and lavish examination of the ways of non-political offenders and common criminals, but having reached 1947, we cannot remain silent about one of the most grandiose of Stalin's decrees. We have already mentioned the famous law of 7/8 or 7/8, on the basis of which they arrested people right and left for taking a stalk of grain, a cucumber, 2 small potatoes, a chip of wood, a spool of thread, all of whom got 10 years. But the requirement of the times as Stalin understood them had changed, and the tenor, which had seemed adequate on the eve of the terrible war, seemed now, in the wake of a worldwide historical victory, inadequate, and so again in complete disregard for the code, and totally overlooking the fact that many different articles and decrees on the subject of thefts and robberies already existed. On June 4th, 1947, a decree was issued which outdid them all. It was instantly christened 4/6 by the undismayed prisoners. The advantages of the new decree lay first of all in its newness. From the very moment it appeared, and a torrent of the crimes it specified would be bound and to burst forth, thereby providing an abundant wave of newly sentenced prisoners. But it offered an even greater advantage in prison terms. If a young girl sent into the fields to get a few ears of grain took along 2 friends for company, an organized gang, or some 12-year-old youngsters went after cucumbers or apples, they were liable to get 20 years in camp. In factories, the maximum sentence was raised from 25 years. This sentence, called a quarter, had been introduced a few days earlier to replace the death penalty, which had been abolished as a humane act. And then, at long last, an ancient shortcoming of the law was corrected. Previously, the only failure to make a denunciation which qualified as a crime against the state had been in connection with political offenses. But now simple failure to report the theft of state or collective farm property earned 3 years of camp, or 7 years of exile. In the years immediately following the decree, whole divisions from the countryside and the cities were sent off to cultivate the islands of Gulag in place of the natives who had died off there. True, these waves were processed through the police and the ordinary courts and did not clog the channels of state security, which, even without them, were overstrained in the post-war years. Stalin's new lines suggesting that it was necessary, in the wake of the victory over fascism, to jail more people more energetically and for longer terms than ever before, had immediate repercussions, of course, on political prisoners. The year 1948-49, notable throughout Soviet public life for intensified persecution and vigilance, was marked by one tragic comedy hitherto unheard of in Stalinist anti-justice, that of the repeaters. This is what, in the language of Gulag, they called those still undestroyed unfortunates of 1937 vintage, who had succeeded in surviving 10 impossible, unendurable years and who, in 1947-48, had timidly stepped forth onto the land of freedom, worn out, broken in health, but hoping to live out in peace what little of their lives remained. But some sort of savage fantasy, or stubborn malice, or unsated vengeance pushed the victorious General Lesmont into issuing the order to arrest all those cripples over again without any new charges. It was even disadvantageous both economically and politically to clog the meat grinder with its own refuse, but Stalin issued the order anyways. Here was a case in which a historical personality simply behaved capriciously toward historical necessity. And so it was necessary to take all of them, though they had hardly had a chance to attach themselves to new places or new families. They were rounded up with much the same weary indolence they themselves now returned with. They knew beforehand the whole way of the cross ahead. They did not ask what for, and they did not say to their families, "I'll be back." They put on their shabbiest rags, poured some makorka into their camp tobacco pouches, and went off to sign the deposition. Only one question: "Are you the one who was in prison?" "Yes." "Take 10 more." At this point, the autocrat decided it wasn't enough to arrest just those who had survived in 1937. But what about the children of his sworn enemies? They too must be imprisoned. They were growing up and they might have notions of vengeance. He may have had a heavy dinner and had a nightmare about those children. They went through the lists, looked around and arrested children, but not very many. They arrested the children of the purged army commanders, but not all the children of the Trotskyites. And so the wave of the vengeful children came into being. Among such children were 17-year-old Lena Kosaryeva and 35-year-old Yelena Rakhovskaya. By 1948, after the great European displacement, Stalin had succeeded once again in tightly barricading himself in and pulling the ceiling down closer to him. In this reduced space, he had recreated the tension of 1937. And so in 1948, 49, and 50, there flowed past alleged spies. 10 years earlier, they had been German and Japanese. Now they were Anglo-American believers. This wave of non-orthodox, for the most part, those geneticists and plant breeders, disciples of the late Vavilov and of Mendel, who had not previously been arrested, just plain ordinary thinking people, and students with particular severity, who had not been sufficiently scared away from the West. It was fashionable to charge them with praise of American technology, praise of American democracy, toadyism towards the West. These waves were not unlike those of 1937, but the sentences were different. The standard sentence was no longer the patriarchal 10 ruble bill, but the new Stalin was 25. By now the tenor was for juveniles. There was a good-sized wave from the new decree on revealing state secrets. State secrets included such things as the district harvest, any figure on epidemics, the type of goods produced by any workshop or mini factory, mention of a civil airport, municipal transport routes, or the family name of any prisoner imprisoned in any camp. For violations of this decree, they gave 15 years. The wave of nationalities were not forgotten either. The Ukrainian nationalists, the Banderovsky, taken in the heat of the struggle from the forests where they fought, kept flowing. All this time, simultaneously, all West Ukrainian country people received tenors and 5 years in camps in exile, presumably for having had connections with the partisans. Someone had let them spend the night, someone had once fed them, someone had not reported them. For about a year, starting in 1950, the waves of wives of the Banderovsky was underway. They gave them each 10 years for failure to make a denunciation, so as to finish off their husbands faster. By this time, the resistance in Lithuania and Estonia had already come to an end, but in 1945, new waves of new social prophylaxis to assure collectivization kept coming. They took whole trainloads of city dwellers and peasants from the 3 Baltic republics into Siberian exile. The historical rhythm was disrupted in these republics. They were forced to recapitulate in brief, limited periods the more extended experience of the rest of the country. In 1948, one more nationalist wave went into exile, that of the Greeks who inhabited the areas around the Sea of Azov, the Kuban, and the Sukhumi. They had done nothing to offend the father during the war, but now he avenged himself on them for his failure in Greece, or so it seemed. This wave, too, was evidently the fruit of his personal insanity. The majority of the Greeks ended up in Central Asian exile. Those who voiced their discontent were thrown into political prisons. Around 1950, to avenge the same lost war, or perhaps just to balance those already in exile, the Greek rebels from Marcos' army, who had been turned over to us by Bulgaria, were themselves shipped off to the archipelago. During the last years of Stalin's life, a wave of Jews became noticeable. From 1950 on, they were hauled in little by little as cosmopolites, and that was why the doctor's case was cooked up. It would appear that Stalin intended to arrange a great massacre of the Jews, but this became the first plan of his life to fail. God told him, apparently with the help of human hands, to depart from his rib cage. The preceding exposition should have made it clear, one would think, that in the removal of millions and the populating of the Gulag, consistent cold-blooded planning and never-weakening persistence were at work. That we never did have any empty prisons, merely prisons which were full or prisons which were very, very overcrowded. And then when you occupied yourself to your heart's content studying the safe secrets of the atomic nucleus, researching the influence of Heidegger on Sartre, or collecting Picasso reproductions, while you rode off in your railroad sleeping compartment to vacation resorts, or building your country house near Moscow, the Black Marines rolled incessantly through the streets, and the gay busty, the security men, knocked at doors and rang doorbells. And I think this exposition proves that the organs always earn their pay. Thank you for listening. It's the end of Chapter 2. Have a good day.